So we've arrived at our keynote address, which I'm sure we've all been looking forward to. So we have Barry Yeoman as our keynote speaker. Barry Yeoman is an award-winning freelance journalist who lives in Durham, North Carolina. He specializes in in-depth reporting that puts a human face on complex issues. Over the years, he has brought readers and listeners into a lab where the fundamental assumptions of dinosaur science are being challenged, a coastline in India where industrialization threatens traditional Muslim fishing families, a training ground for private soldiers on secret missions, a Turkish bird paradise that could soon be underwater, corner blues joints in New Orleans that struggle to keep their doors open, and the inside of his own DNA. He's the author of The Gut Bucket King, a long-form multimedia story about blues, blood, and redemption, which you should all read online tomorrow. Barry has been active in the self-help movement since 1992, when he attended the Third World Congress of People Who Stutter. He is a co-founder of Passing Twice, an informal network of LGBT people who stutter and their allies, and an advisor to the Stutter Talk podcast. Let's welcome Barry to the stage.
Thank you, Darren. Is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
It is on. And thanks to all the organizers for making this event happen, and for inviting me as keynote, and to all of you for listening to me. I'm welling over with appreciation for the efforts of the New York City Chapters to launch a conversation about, and maybe even redefine, what it means to be a stuttering community in 2016 and beyond. This is something of a homecoming for me. Although I've lived in North Carolina for more than 30 years, that's not where I began. In 1979, after growing up in the Long Island suburbs, I moved into a dormitory at NYU, where I was starting the second semester of my freshman year. As an undergraduate, I lived in various neighborhoods from Washington Heights to Park Slope, but mostly in Greenwich Village near NYU's campus. There are places all around here, all around this building, that are iconic to me because they represent what it means to claim your place in a city and in a society where you're viewed as less than equal. In my teens and early 20s, the realization that my friends and I had a voice to assert our full participation was a heady notion, and one that has stuck with me in the 3.5 decades since. 14 blocks from here is Sheridan Square, which, when I moved here in '79, was a center of a vibrant gay community. And although I didn't fully understand it at the time, was maybe one of the reasons I chose NYU. That vibrancy was new, and it owed itself to something that happened 10 years earlier, a 3-night rebellion that followed a routine raid at the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street, right off 7th Avenue. One reason the police felt they had license to raid gay bars, to arrest vulnerable men and women, some of whom were not out to their parents, to their employers, to their spouses and children, was because homosexuality in 1969 was viewed as a pathology. It was listed in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the Bible of the mental health profession, first as a sociopathic personality disturbance, despite research to the contrary, and later as a more benign psychiatric disorder. It was medicalized with the consent of certain gay leaders who believed this would lead to more humane treatment than viewing homosexuality as a sin or a moral failing. Moving beyond that acquiescence to the medical model into a proud and joyful claiming of identity took a new generation of leaders, most of them young. Remember the Stonewall Rebellion. I'll come back to it later. Equally important in my geography of this neighborhood is St. Vincent's, now closed, but once the flagship hospital of the Catholic Church in New York City. I was a junior at NYU when the first reports emerged of a constellation of rare diseases that were killing gay men: rapid, ugly deaths that baffled physicians and scientists. As the hospital serving Greenwich Village, St. Vincent's was home to the first and largest AIDS ward on the East Coast. But it was not always like that. Initially, patients were not admitted to rooms, but rather languished on gurneys in the hallways. There were numerous reports of inhumane treatment, including, famously, an assault on a gay couple by a security guard. It was this, among myriad other life-threatening indignities, that led to the formation of ACT UP, which we were talking about earlier, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, one of several grassroots groups that seized and changed the conversation, and in the process saved untold number of lives. Remember ACT UP. I'll come back to them later. I want this speech to be a little provocative, not for provocation's sake, but rather to get us thinking more expansively about the potential for our community. Most of us, when we walk into our first big stuttering conference, are presented with an agenda, a set of goals created by those who run the organization, some of whom stutter, some of whom don't. It can be so emotionally overwhelming to be, for the first time, among hundreds of other people who stutter, that maybe we don't take the time to consider that agenda, to evaluate it, to figure out whether it syncs with our own agenda, even to contemplate what our own agenda might look like. After having spent our childhoods and early adulthoods shuttling from one speech therapist to the next, learning about this fluency shaping technique or that razzle-dazzle device, we lack the context for stepping back, clearing the slate, and asking, what can this community look like at its best, at its most compassionate, at its most empowered? I have some thoughts. Surely you have thoughts too. Please allow me to launch the conversation. To understand where I'm coming from, I think it's useful to go back to 1979 when I first showed up at Weinstein Residence Hall just off Washington Square. I arrived as a bright, skinny, awkward freshman, former editor of my high school newspaper, and someone whose body had failed me utterly. Growing up, I couldn't throw a baseball, couldn't play the clarinet, couldn't muster the attraction I was supposed to feel toward women, and of course, I couldn't talk. After a decade of failed therapy, bounces, prolongations, delayed auditory feedback, Marilyn Monroe-style breathy speech, my parents had finally taken me to Dr. Martin Schwartz, whose book, Stuttering Solved, promised a success rate, success meaning fluency, of 94%. All you had to do to treat stuttering, all you had to do was treat stuttering mechanically, mastering passive airflow, and you would never stutter again. Bam, simple. I remember the intake interview with Dr. Schwartz right after my high school graduation. My parents were there too. The nationally known stuttering expert looked at me and said, "I have one question for you. What is your name?" As my face contorted like a ghastly mask and stray syllables tried but failed to leave my lips, Dr. Schwartz sat back, satisfied at achieving the effect he hoped to produce. "Take my 2-day group workshop," he promised, "and you'll never suffer this humiliation again." I remember those 2 beautiful days of fluency. I was 18 and was offered the promise of normalcy. During my undergraduate years, I dutifully attended what Dr. Schwartz called a support group here in New York City, which was really a series of gatherings in someone's living room to practice passive airflow. The notion that people who stuttered could get together and improve our own lives without the mediation of a doctor was beyond the realm of possibility for any of us back then. And when I slipped back into the severe stutter, I didn't need Dr. Schwartz to tell me what I already assumed I knew, that it was my own fault for not trying hard enough. What a difference between how I was treating my stuttering and how I was treating the newfound realization that I was gay. At NYU, surrounded by other gay and lesbian friends, I moved quickly past shame and into the hopefulness of self-discovery. I dated men. I had late-night conversations with other gay friends in the dorm lobby. We went out for midnight meals at Phoebe's Tavern on the Bowery and smiled in recognition at others whom we recognized as kindred spirits. I marched in my first Pride March, got arrested at a sit-in when New York City Council refused to pass a gay rights bill, spent countless hours hunkered down at a gay history archive on the Lower East Side for my senior thesis. I learned how the gay liberation movement that followed Stonewall was instrumental in the removal of homosexuality from the DSM, the Mental Health Bible, in 1973. None of this was easy. Gay relationships were illegal in New York until 1981, and violence was rampant. Personally, I had a negative body image to fight and old shame to pack away. But at least I knew the end game, a playful, intimate life, embracing my sexuality and the community it brought me, seizing from better educated straight people the power to define me. After college, I moved south and launched what has become, a little to my surprise, a successful journalism career. By then, I had drifted away from Dr. Schwartz, but I continued attending university speech clinics. I swear, I went through student clinicians faster than I went through college boyfriends. And I think I might have worked their every last nerve. My nerves were pretty shot too, as I sat in traffic each Monday afternoon at 5 en route to a speech therapy clinic that I knew would bring me neither fluency nor peace. One progress report from 1988 described me as resistant. It went on to say, and I'm quoting here, therapy sessions began to be dominated by discussions of Barry's frustration with his disfluency, with only a little time to work on breaking up his blocks. Barry began to feel that desensitization exercises were making him increasingly afraid of stuttering and of speaking situations in general. It became apparent that Barry would need to work on reducing the non-speech related stresses in his life before he could adequately deal with his stuttering. After a weekend at the beach, Barry decided to take a break from speech therapy. What came next was my own personal experience. I'm not suggesting it will work for you, since we all have our own needs, we all have our own styles, plus the times are different. Speech therapy in some cases has gotten considerably better, but it sure worked for me back then. I decided to make that break from speech therapy permanent. I packed my bag of tricks, and I never went back. I was 27 and done. It helped that in the late 80s, we were in the throes of the AIDS crisis, which put my stutter into some perspective. Before antiretroviral drugs made the disease manageable in the mid-90s, HIV killed 300,000 gay and bisexual men in the United States alone. I knew some of them. Lost 3 of my best friends in 88, 89, and 93. And like many of my friends, I watched vibrant lives sputter out unpredictably, just as they were taking on definition. I also watched as ACT UP grew into a national force that literally stopped traffic, disrupted conferences, refused to budge from the headquarters of drug manufacturers. In the process, ACT UP and its spin-off, the Treatment Action Group, succeeded in moving new medicines through the pipeline and into patients' hands with record speeds. With lives at stake, priorities became clear, and polite deference to the powers that be was low on the list. The 4 years after I quit speech therapy followed a course that was reminiscent of my coming out as a gay man. I demedicalized stuttering for myself, stopped thinking of it as a condition that needed to be fixed by professional intervention. Ironically, as an aside, over the next few years, I began stuttering much less. I came out of the closet, that is, I wrote a column about my stutter for the newspaper that employed me, and I found a community of supportive, successful, funny, ethical, good-looking people like yourselves, whose common bond was our stutter. For me, that community was an international one, as my first gathering was the 1992 World Congress of People Who Stutter in San Francisco. It was hosted by NSA's predecessor, the National Stuttering Project, or NSP. Now, NSP was no ACT UP. They were not getting arrested outside Michael Palin's office to protest the demeaning depiction of people who stutter in a fish called Wanda. But what thrilled me was that this was definitely a movement of stutterers doing it for ourselves. Some of NSP's veterans drew inspiration from the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the gay and lesbian movement. They had watched the emergence of deaf culture, particularly capital D deaf culture, that rejected the premise that deafness was a disability that needed eradication. Capital D deaf folks had and have no interest in hearing or speaking vocally, thank you, because what they were building was just as rich in communication as mainstream hearing culture. And of course, the self-help leaders I met back then knew about the larger disability rights movement, which at its best joined forces with other minority groups to demand equal treatment. You'll hear more about the disability rights movement later from Chris and Emma. The self-help movement that I first encountered in the 90s didn't reject speech therapy or exclude the professional community. SLPs were welcome, as long as they understood that we who stuttered were steering this particular ship. There was a pretty wide range of perspectives within an NSP conference, but for the first time, I was among people who were creating a space for the idea that we held the answers, not the experts, not the scientists, we did. In that space, some of my friends and I created an informal network called Passing Twice for LGBT people stutter and our allies. I'm looking at you, Elizabeth Kapstein. We quickly recognized that the lessons of the post-Stonewall gay liberation movement, and maybe even ACT UP, were relevant to stuttering too. We could celebrate diversity, form communities, support one another as we build productive lives and careers, help one another through the hard times, declaring that we didn't need to be changed. To the degree that we intersected with speech professionals, it was on our terms, focused on our goals, and for most of us, secondary to what we could provide each other. I think it's no secret that the self-help movement has grown more professionalized over the last 20 years. NSA, an organization that continues to mean a lot to me, sponsors clinical research symposia that confer continuing education credits on SLPs. It has an ambitious plan to raise millions for research. It talks about promising medications and genetic discoveries that can vanquish stuttering once and for all. This can lead to contradictory messages. We are the cure. We need a cure. I understand that these contradictions, that these tensions can make us stronger as a community. I also want to convey my respect to those who see research support and professional development as important goals for the self-help movement. And I know that my perspective comes from a place of privilege. I have a college education, a good career, and reasonable financial stability, and that allows me to take the long view rather than thinking about fixing my speech so I might land a restaurant job. I can survive without fluency. What's more, aging has brought in me certain normal neurological changes, which means that I stutter less at 55 than I did in my 20s and 30s. With that on the table, it still seems to me like these two sentences, we need a cure and we are the cure, represent the juncture at which our movement stands. And from my perspective, I agree strongly with former NSA Chair Kenny Carroll, the first person I ever heard say the words, "We are the cure." There's place for research about stuttering as long as it's conducted ethically and not used, for example, for genetic selection for fluency. And my God, there's certainly room for improving stuttering therapy. People who stutter should have strong inputs into both of these arenas. But if we think of these as two main pillars of our movement, I fear we're losing an opportunity to take control of our lives, to build a compassionate community, in short, to put the self back in self-help. While it's not up to me or up to any individual to dictate where the movement should be heading, I'd nonetheless like to suggest some alternative courses for the next generation to consider. I see the potential of the movement as twofold: to make our own lives better and to serve the millions who stutter but may never show up at our conferences. Let me suggest some goals for both departments. On the individual side, I want to make sure that everyone who stutters feels like there's a place they can come for mentoring, that they feel that there's somebody they can turn to for career advice, for dating advice, for advice about dealing with their parents or their therapists. I want everyone who stutters to know that when they're having a bad day, there's someone they can call and vent to. I want a self-help movement that fosters the idea that we who stutter can do so uninhibitedly, focusing on the meaningful things we have to share, and maybe even enjoying the syncopated rhythms of our stutters, rather than fixating on our shortcomings in achieving fluency. I want this to happen at the chapter level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the global level. I want the national organization to provide local chapters with the resources they need to make this happen. I want a movement in which every child, every young adult who finds us understands from the start that speaking with a stutter, even a severe one, is an option, that there is no shame in it, and that there is in fact music in it. I want them to understand that speech therapy is an option too, but it's not the only option. And if we choose it, we get to decide what type of therapy we need. I want everyone who walks into a chapter meeting or a regional or national conference or a World Congress to feel like they've come home. I want them to feel equally at home, whether they are severe or mild or covert or young or old or black or white or Asian or Hispanic or Native American or gay or straight or poor or affluent or college educated or not. I want a movement that is introspective enough to figure out who is not in the room and why, and then proactive enough and culturally competent enough to reach out and include them. And by include, I mean not just at a participation level, but also at a decision-making level as well. On the social side, my ideas are more specific. As I said earlier, they're informed by the post-Stonewall gay liberation movement, by the life-saving direct actions of ACT UP and similar group, by my own early days in the stuttering self-help world, and by such profound community building efforts as capital D Deaf Culture. At the World Stuttering Congress in the Netherlands in 2013, the British novelist David Mitchell, read his books, surprised many of us by calling stuttering, or in his words, stammering, a political issue. No one's expecting us to march on Parliament with megaphones, Mitchell said, explaining that we're perceived to be politically marginal and small in numbers, which we're not, he added. There's millions of us, but to be politically active, first you have to out yourself as a person with a stammer. So, with Mitchell's words in mind, I want every person who is applying for a job with a corporation, a university, or a government agency to know that the HR manager has been educated by us about stuttering, how to talk with us, how to listen to us, how to understand communications competency in a way that's broader than fluency. I want stuttering awareness to be part of a workplace diversity training because we put it there, we demanded its inclusion, and provided the perspective that's lacking in many workplaces now. I want everyone who has faced discrimination because of their stutter to know that there's a local self-help chapter that has their back, and a regional chapter that has the back of the local chapter, and a national organization with the legal muscle to blow the offender away in court. I want would-be bigots to be afraid of a lawsuit coming from the stuttering world and to modify their practices accordingly. I want some of that legal muscle to be harnessed toward a lawsuit that will determine once and for all that people who stutter are covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Disability does not mean we're incompetent. Legally, we are disabled when somebody, say an employer, thinks we can't do the job and acts on that prejudice. If a keynote speaker addresses our conferences and suggests we should not have access to the courts, as I've seen happen, we should feel empowered enough to challenge them and maybe even to boo them into reconsideration. I want every movie producer who uses stuttering as a cheap proxy for weakness, repression, or moral failing to expect an organized, visible backlash. To quote David Mitchell again, public figures who mock stammerers This should be as much a no-go zone as blind people or the use of racist terminology. Politically, we need to illuminate public ignorance. Here again, we can draw inspiration from gay and lesbian activists who organized colorful and effective street theater protests against negative media depictions, especially in the early days of the AIDS crisis. One of the groups during these protests was called the Swift and Terrible Retribution Committee. We could use one of those, no? I want a movement that has the power to shut down every scam artist who peddles a miracle cure. And I want every person who stutters to have access to information produced by us about what's truly obtainable and desirable in speech therapy. I also want them to know that supportive psychotherapy or no therapy might be an equally reasonable or even better option. In the longer term, I want us to be strategizing about both how to create an organizational culture and how to create a larger society where people who choose to just keep stuttering and to reject the notion of stuttering as a medical disorder feel fully embraced. I want us to hold researchers' feet to the ethical fire. I don't want to say I told you so the first time a fetus is aborted because it has the stuttering genes. And finally, I want a movement that collaborates with other movements of traditionally marginalized people, making us all stronger. I could continue, but I want to leave some ideas, some time for your ideas too. So I'll end with some words I heard last week from Mia Birdsong, who helps run the Family Story Project, a group in Oakland, California that is transforming the stories that families tell about themselves. Her words are about people who live in poverty, but as I listen to them, I realize they could just as well apply to us. We cannot wait for somebody else to get it right, she said. Let us remember what we're capable of. Instead of trying to alter the fabric of existing ways, let's use some of our collective power toward inventing and bringing to life new ways of being that work for us. Thank you.